Hey, MBA hopefuls, and welcome to MBA Waves. We are on the air. Today we are talking about GMAT waivers. And if you need one, which schools to look at. And today we are joined by our guest, Linda Abraham from accepted.com. How you doing, Linda?
I'm doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Bara and Krithika. How you doing, guys?
I'm doing good. I'm dry. It's not raining. That's exciting.
It's
Hey
gloomy and
everyone,
wet here.
Krithika from Bangalore. It's pretty good.
Nice. Let's just jump right into it. So, taking a minute just to give some background, some context about the GMAT. Why does it exist, and what benefits are there to the schools? Linda, if you want to be our guest, you can take the lead on any responses.
Sure. So the GMAT is a constant among applicants. Unlike the GPA, unlike work experience, it's something that all candidates take, and it's the same across the board. Grading scales are notoriously variable. Work experience just varies on the person. This is a constant. It also correlates very much to success in the first year of business school. And no school wants to admit people who are going to flunk out. It's another very, I think, legitimate use of the test, and it's one way to provide evidence of academic ability and that the candidate can really handle the program that they're applying to. Less, how should I say, maybe less intended, but it's also used. The average GMAT score for an entering class is also used as evidence of class quality. All right, the higher the average GMAT, the more schools brag about it. Recruiters sometimes will use that in deciding whether to recruit or not. And alumni like to brag about it. Students, applicants look at it as, evidence of how competitive is the school, how competitive are they? And some recruiters will use an individual's GMAT score as a screening device when deciding whether to interview or pursue a candidate for a job. So I think those are the main tasks of the GMAT. The first two are what it was intended for. In other words, evidence of academic ability and a constant across all candidates. The others are some things that have developed over time.
We definitely saw that where I used to work. I wasn't in charge of the program. I was doing recruitment, but I would often hear that candidates who did poorly on the GMAT relative to their classmates were the ones that struggled the most, especially in like finance or maybe macroeconomics, and even had to repeat some classes and so they really started to take heed to the value of the GMAT in that sense. Because let's face it, if you can't handle it, it's mainly high school math in the GMAT. The things you're going to learn onwards are going to be a challenge.
Oh yeah. Yeah,
I'll jump in and say something about just to add to it also is that, the GMAT is a real opportunity to start thinking like a business person. And because it's a reasoning test, if you could get ahead of the game, and it's the same thing with the LSAT. It's the same thing for the MCAT, at least for the CAR section. It's really giving you the opportunity to get into the mindset. So the test, I totally agree with what you're saying, Linda. It is like, it's just factually, it is a test that everyone is taking. It's the same thing. So you can look at applicants across the board, right? And you don't need to do lots of test prep just to score high. I mean, it does help. I mean, you're buying time, but it gives you the opportunity to learn to reason better. So the schools can see, well, are you a risk taker? How are you in terms of time management, right? And so whether it's the SAT or any of them, it really, we'll get into school waivers and the test itself, but it really it's just an opportunity for self-development.
Yeah, and to add to it, I would say that GMAT is one of the best ways that someone can salvage their application, especially if their CGPA was not up to the par, or even their work experience is like not from a great company and so on. So GMAT is a way to differentiate yourself and to stand out. And that said, in terms of even like considering the MBA application journey as a project in itself, once you start working towards a GMAT, you allocate some time towards it, and you're also showing commitment to the school. Especially, I would say the number of attempts that somebody takes, right? It shows how badly do they want to get in, and also self-awareness about what it takes to get into B school.
Good point.
Yeah, absolutely. Working in admissions and recruitment, I would hear a lot of people saying, "Oh, I don't want to, take it a second time. It's going to look bad." And actually, on the contrary, you very often
If it
hear
goes up, it looks great.
Yeah, but I mean, even the fact that you're trying, if the second time you take it, it doesn't really go up, but it shows something about your character that you're willing to take the time and work on something and improve your score. That speaks volumes. And hopefully, if not the second time, the third time, it does increase. And in terms of advantages for the students, I mean, there's a couple of things there. I mean, often they call the GMAT your first MBA class, right? And it is that warm up for your brain for people who probably haven't been in a classroom for a little while. So there's that. It is, as you guys mentioned, a measure of quality to be sure that the other people with whom you're going to be taking this MBA program are of same or higher like intelligence and commitment to improving themselves. You do want to be surrounded by people that are motivated, because that's going to affect the overall energy of the cohort and incentivize you to work harder as well. So it's kind of like a collective energy thing. And, there is those bragging rights that you hear as alumni that people talk about their scores. And I think one of you alluded to the fact that employment post-MBA, that's a thing too, especially if you're looking at careers in, say, investment banking or management consulting. Many of the top firms do look at GMAT score as one of their metrics for hiring. And well, we could talk about this a little bit later. If you end up getting a waiver, how does that affect your employment potential?
Right. I've heard different things on the employment. At one point I heard that especially the management consulting firms were not using the GMAT or the GRE. And then I heard they were again. So I don't know if it changed or somebody was just misinformed. But
yeah, there's probably trends. I mean, you've been in the game for a little while. I'm sure you've seen things come and go. Maybe it depends on a particular year. If, say, McKinsey or Bain has got a huge flood of applicants, and it's just, hey, we're going to bring in this metric as a way to filter out some of our applicants to be able to narrow down the pool.
Right.
So, who should be asking for these waivers? Like, who have been successful in getting GMAT waivers? And we can talk about the different reasons, but I don't know if you have Linda, if you have an idea in a broad sense, who should be asking?
Well, I think first of all, there's two different kinds of waivers, right? There are across the board waivers, right? Nobody has to take a test. And then what I think most schools that are issuing waivers, they ask a student to submit an application for a waiver or a statement why they don't need to take the GMAT or the GRE or the EA, whatever test is required. I think there are relatively few schools at this point that don't have any testing requirements. Now, in terms of who should submit a test, I think, like Krithika said, people who have a low GPA or a GPA that they feel doesn't represent their ability, then I think the test can really be evidence of academic ability. Again, it correlates. There's all kinds of data, all kinds of testing that say it correlates to success in B school, especially in the first year. So if somebody has a low GPA that they feel doesn't really represent their ability, then by all means, prepare for, study for the test, and get the best score you can, because it can really, really pay off. The other thing I think it can pay off is if you are trying for grants, scholarships that don't have to be paid back. Basically, if you make the school look good, you are more likely to get a scholarship. And one way to make the school look good is to raise that average test score number. So that would be another reason to take the test. If you test poorly and you feel that your academic record really does represent you well, then I would say go for the waiver. But if it's that kind of a question. I don't think it's everybody should go for a waiver and nobody should go for a waiver. I think it really depends very much on your academic qualifications.
You said it in 2 words. It depends. And that's the answer for most questions in this world.
Right,
it's a very,
right.
high touch kind of thing.
To add to Linda's point here, I would say that, see, at the end of the day, these tests were a mechanism for people to demonstrate their academic readiness, is the word that schools want to use. So they were also willing to accept other tests like MCAT, LSAT, PCAT, DAT, your executive assessment, obviously, and so on. So they were okay to accept it as well in lieu of the GMAT. But then if you are able to demonstrate quantitative abilities through a master's degree, or through like something as intensive as a CFA or a CPA and so on, and of course you have like a stellar academic record, then or even if you have like a prior score that has been expired, so you would still be like a very good successful applicant to get the waiver.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
And so, let's talk about the latest big fuss about GMAT waivers, right? Most people have seen the article in Wall Street Journal, saw the announcement from Kellogg in November, I think it was, mid-November, where they were offering waivers to people who've been laid off by big tech, right? We had this big wave of big tech employees from companies like Twitter when Elon Musk went off the deep end, and Facebook was probably seeing some challenges with their lack of excitement around the metaverse, and a few other examples. I think Uber and Lyft as well. There were a number of layoffs, and so they, I think, made a very bold move, right, to say, hey, if you've been laid off from big tech, we're going to waive the GMAT for you. It's probably a little bit of a case-by-case thing, but broadly speaking, I think anyone from that category had the opportunity to submit their application without a GMAT and be considered for admission, assuming that people who have been working in big tech have probably been vetted quite a bit, are probably pretty bright people with a good business sense, and that they would probably blend in with the class. That is assuming there's probably an interview behind that they would have another layer of assessment. But let's talk about that. I know, Linda, you had written an article or a blog about this at the end of last year. Do you want to share some of the key takeaways from your article?
Great. Well, first of all, Kellogg was the first school, but there were several schools that came after Kellogg. And as you say, they're responding to the increase in layoffs, specifically in tech, but it is spreading. Goldman Sachs also announced massive layoffs, I think, at the very beginning of the year. And there have been other companies that have announced layoffs, or, kind of tech and something else. I think Peloton announced layoffs, a bunch of companies. And mostly white collar workers, not the, blue collar workers. So this is affecting people who maybe had thought of an MBA but weren't going to apply now, or maybe didn't want the MBA. Now they're thinking of the MBA. And I think the schools wanted to encourage them to apply. It's just very simple. So the question was, how are they going to do that? Now, all the schools say that they're motivated by compassion and empathy for the recently laid off workers who had no way of anticipating this event. And I'm sure that is a part of it. I'm not going to disagree with that. I also think they're probably motivated by the fact that they have room. They have room for these people. And as Eric, you said, they believe that if they, given the fact that these people have gotten these jobs at very hard to get into companies, that in and of itself is like a test. And there still is a transcript. There still is the resume. There still is an interview. So they have so Kellogg in particular had the confidence to do it. Many people criticize Kellogg because they said it's not fair. People who kept their jobs are going to have to take the test. People who applied round one had to submit the test. So I think other schools, either because they agreed with the critics of Kellogg or because they just were uncomfortable with it, they took different routes. Some of them said, we'll add a round, like Duke, right? So they have a round, a mid-February round that they added. They kept their final round the same date, but they added a mid-February round, and they told applicants that you can submit your test score at the end of February as long as your application is in by the due date, which I think is February 13th. But I'd have to, don't. I'm going by memory on that one, so double check that one. And then we have a list online of all the schools that have made accommodations. Some of them are saying you can submit your test score a little later after you can submit your application. Others are saying, again, at different rounds, some are waiving application fees. So there's all different kinds of accommodations that schools are making to encourage applicants to apply even after the second round deadline, which is usually when the bulk of applications are received.
So one other point I wanted to add here was that definitely taking from Linda's point here is that schools do want to push application volumes. And this we know that when Ross probably introduced a waiver. They saw the volumes go up by double the year before. So it is a good mechanism for what I would say to basically hook on to moment marketing in so to speak. But that said, I also want to point out that the GMAT and even the EA and other exams are pretty intensive, both in terms of time as well as like money. So, like in terms of for somebody who's laid off immediately, you do want to have that consideration. So, from that point of view, who's somebody who's laid off, I would say that it was a good move. But then again, that nobody goes to an MBA thinking, "Oh, I'm going to go to an MBA tomorrow." So they have like a lot of prep work happening before, right? So I would assume that those who are really serious about it would have started it beforehand. So for them, it may not be that helpful, and people who are really serious about it would have like caught on to round one. But then again, as Linda said, it might be for those who may have been on the fence and want to try to look at the better career options now that they're laid off.
It may also be that people were planning to apply the following year or the next 2 years. Now that they're laid off, they're saying maybe I should apply now. Applying a year or two earlier and getting in a year or two earlier means that you have a post MBA salary for a year or two additionally. So that can really pay off.
Literally.
Yeah.
I think the last time we spoke, Linda, we discussed about the recession, right? We were talking about whether the recession was happening and if it was a good time to do an MBA. So it really gives the opportunity to the applicant to think all of these different pieces, especially like what happens when you have so many people from tech applying to so many of these schools. I mean, I don't know the numbers. I don't know if any of us know the numbers, but what happens when those are the people that you're competing against, and how do the schools look at that? What if you have this, huge rush of all of these people that didn't take these standardized tests? Maybe they might be spectrum, they might not be, right? So I think the interview is super important. But the numbers in the job market, right?
Right.
So it's interesting how are they going to think of their class and what's their quota of how many people they will accept from this particular pool.
Well, I mean, the tech numbers have been pretty big. I mean, I think some schools have, both coming from tech, going into tech related. I mean, if you work for McKinsey, for example, and you're doing technology consulting, are you a technologist or are you a consultant? I mean, there's definitely overlap between these fields.
Mm.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that so many schools made accommodations, one, they felt, and I know MIT in particular did, because I interviewed Donna Levinson of MIT, and she said this is going to, this might very well spill over, and it has, into other industries. So while Kellogg defined it very narrowly in terms of tech, I think laid off in the fourth quarter, other schools have been much broader in terms of allowing these applicants to apply for these accommodations.
So let's talk about some of those other schools, Linda.
Yeah.
I know that Michigan Ross has been in there. Who else comes to mind? Tepper.
Right. UCLA.
Yeah. You want to give some more specific insights, if you don't mind, about like maybe some of the parameters with some of these other schools that people might be interested to know if they fall into those categories?
I think from most of the other schools, it's pretty broad. Some of them is just any laid off worker. I think that's MIT. They don't care if they're in tech or not. Duke did not limit it to laid off workers, if I recall. So let me look at this up real fast.
I think it's such like a hot thing that's been changing kind of not by the minute, but relatively quickly. And so if this is something you're considering, the best thing you can do is, first of all, have a look at the website, read what they're writing about on LinkedIn or Twitter. And if you're unsure, talk to one of the school reps and say, hey, is this a possibility? Being that this seems to be a trend these days, and see if that's a possibility for you. But does it make sense for you and for your career path? Talking about some of the risks in not taking these tests, like we talked about employment and competitiveness and so forth. You have to weigh your options. And I think it's really about understanding your career path, doing your research, and seeing if this is the right move for you.
It kind of goes back to it depends, like you said before. But I think the other thing, and I stuck my neck out, I think, a little bit in June, and I might have gotten my timing off a little bit also, is if the unemployment rate increases, and significantly so, then you're likely to see applications go up. I think the fact that the schools are making these accommodations indicates that application volume, certainly round one application volume, was down. So if you take advantage of these accommodations, you may be, again, not only getting in earlier, but also getting in a cycle when it's easier to get in and getting into programs that you might not get into next cycle. Again, unemployment has been, very low in the United States. It has, is it going to go up? When is it going to go up? I thought it was going to go up a little faster than it has.
About now, I mean, if I recall in the conversation we had on a previous episode of MBA Waves, we were talking about this anticipated major economic recession, especially considering the war in Ukraine and oil prices, grain prices, and so on, that you were like, your message mainly in your article and your conversation we had with you was like, now is the time. Now is a great time to apply before the recession happens and application volumes increase and competition increases for applicants. And it seems to still be the case. The recession's kind of held off still.
Certainly the impact on the job market is held off. Whether we're in a recession or not in a recession, that's above my pay grade. But the unemployment rate is still low. So, is it going to stay low? I don't know, but it's low now. If it goes up, historically, it's always been that unemployment goes up, application goes up, competition increases for MBA programs. Basically, what I'm saying is I think it's a really good idea if anybody's thinking of an MBA to go for it.
Yeah. Reading between the lines, or now very explicitly, now is still a great time to apply.
Yeah, someone is saying that the best time to write a recession is from the insights of a B-school classroom. You don't want to be out there.
So I did look up. Most of the accommodations are, at least initially, and then you can still check with the schools, are for recently laid off workers. All right, not some in the tech industry, like NYU's Andrew Koo program, but MIT Sloan is for laid off workers. Indiana Kelley laid off tech workers. Duke, all applicants. They added around. They're doing it because of the layoffs, but they're not limiting applicants to laid off workers. And Cornell MBA and Cornell Tech also for qualified applicants who've recently been laid off. So again, most schools are limiting it to laid off workers, but not all. And as you said, Eric, check with the schools.
We have a comment that's come in from one of our colleagues. You guys all know Marlena. I'm going to pop that on the screen. Sure. She asks, what about college seniors? So it's a little bit of a different population, but thinking about deferred programs, admission programs, or 2+2 as Harvard calls it, right? Who may decide relatively late to apply to begin an MBA in the fall. Any special consequences or advice for them?
They're a very different kind of category. And I think I would be very hesitant to apply without a test score, because they're really looking for the creme de la creme. And I think they would have to submit a test score. And most schools don't care whether it's the GRE or the GMAT, but and also internships count and all that.
Not only that, they don't have their final grades yet. They're
and most of the deferred admit programs expect them to apply late. Right, HBS 2+2. I think that is their April or March deadlines.
Yeah, it's in April. Yeah.
Okay. And most of the Morellis program at Wharton, that's also a late application deadline. So they're not expecting them to apply what traditionally is round 1 or round 2 for the MBA. And they want to see the first semester grades or the second quarter grades if you're on the quarter system. And again, I would be very hesitant to apply to any of those programs without a test score.
Yeah, I agree. So sorry, Melanie, you have to tell your clients that they need to take that test.
Good question, though.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I like to think of what we call as spike factors. I know Rotman uses the term spike factors.
Right.
So if you feel that you have enough spike factors in your profile to help you stand out, then probably you don't need to take the test. But like, especially when I'm talking about spike factors, I'm talking about those that probably point to your ability to do well in, say, I don't know, microeconomics or accounting and things like that, which you may not have touched for quite some time, as Eric, you pointed out. But like, if you don't really have like one thing to note is that if you still get these waivers, it doesn't mean that you get like an automatic guaranteed admit or anything. It's just that you got a waiver. You still would be evaluated holistically, um, like everybody else gets done. It's just that you don't have one additional component. So I would say that unless you really have a reason, which could be because of some poor health or like truly like even like as the layoff was an example. I mean, if you don't really have like a strong reason, I would say please go take the test because it helps you stand out.
Right.
So we often in admissions view the admissions the application kind of like in a pie model. We have the different components of the pie, and we would say like, okay, you want to have at least like 85% of the pie there, right? And whether that's filled up with like great grades from undergrad, great GMAT score, great interview, essays, references, whatever it may be, but that pie's got to be at least like 85% there for you to be considered. And so if you're lacking in some area, like either because you're still in college and you don't have your grades yet, or your grades have suffered, you can compensate for that with a better GMAT score. And like Linda was saying, if you've got a low score, but you feel that your grades are really representative of what you can produce in the MBA level and they're quite strong, then you can try without that GMAT score or GRE score.
It's especially if you don't test well.
Yeah.
Well, there's always solutions if you don't test well. I mean, I think that people really embrace that, but people can do what they want to do.
Okay.
Let me ask Linda and Bara, who are in the States, where I think accommodations for people with any kind of disabilities, whether it be physical or learning, the States is very strong in meeting those accommodations, whether it be at the workplace or in schools or whatever. So I think it's more and more common to have people like declare or officially, at their school or workplace that they have XYZ disability. So that's the kind of thing that affects their testing ability. Do you find that as a common, like not excuse, but justification for not taking the test, and do you see MBA programs accepting that in the admissions process as a justification for getting a waiver?
It's definitely a justification for getting a waiver, and people who have learning disabilities should seek those accommodations. In my view, I don't know, Bara, what do you say?
Well, I think that it's important that you be considered, even if you've got a particular limitation in some way, and it's a legitimate thing to pursue.
Yeah. And there's no downside. You're not dinged for it or anything like that in the evaluation process.
That's great. And I don't know if you've seen, because you've both been around in this longer than I have you seen or heard stories about how okay, what does that translate? Somebody who is not submitted because of learning disability, they're not a good test taker, but they still are very successful in the program, employment afterwards. Have you heard any stories like follow up?
I mean, people who get accommodations also typically get them when they're in the program for taking tests. They might be able to take it in a room by themselves. They might get additional time. And I think I haven't heard anything that they don't do well once they have those accommodations. So I think they go out in the world and they do fine.
It's fantastic.
Yeah. I don't know how they do so much in the workplace. That's where, I'm not so sure. I don't know, Bara, do you have any information on that?
No, and I'm only thinking about when I was in grad school, another student who the school gave her support, right? They really went out of their way to provide whatever services they needed in order to excel. And I know she's gone on to have an academic career, and she worked harder because of her particular learning challenge, but she's doing great.
So
Yeah.
I could speak for a couple clients who had ADHD. So that's also one of the things, and that gets that people can get accommodations for, and they just have to take it prior, and it allows them to, there is like people reach out to them and ask them like what do they need. They have like a standard set of things that are provided for those who need it as well. So I would say it's a very standard approach, and of course, it really helps. So when my client had taken it earlier, this was before they had like been diagnosed with ADHD, and they felt it very hard to obviously prepare for it and focus as much. But once they knew about this, the fact that they had this, and they were able to like apply for accommodations and take the test again, there was like a market difference. It was also because in the way that they were approaching the test, but also because accommodations really helped them. They would be given a separate kind of like a place, and taking into account there's not too much noise and things like that, which can really help them perform better in the test. And the fact that for them they also have additional break scheduled, so that they don't have to. I mean, they need the necessary time to recuperate in between.
All right. So that kind of wraps up what we wanted to talk about waiver opportunities, unless any of you had additional points to bring up.
The only thing that I will say about the accommodations that I have heard of is that they're pretty standard, right? There's not a big customization with accommodations. Like I've heard of, time and a half or double time, and I don't even know specifically for GMAT. I'm really thinking more about the SATs and the ACTs. So I don't know. I just don't know how much customization goes in on that. So that's something to consider too.
Just going back.
I need to listen to classical music when I take the exam. It's like, that's not going to fly.
Bach won't work, huh?
No.
I just wanted to add something in terms of the schools and the whole waiver thing since Kellogg's announcement, which was quite a PR coup in addition to kind of starting things off. I mean, the GMAT. Well, we've been talking about it as a way to boost your chances of acceptance. I think the schools were in their actions were also looking at as a barrier to entry, a barrier to application, and they removed, for those schools that waived it, they removed that barrier in order to increase the likelihood that they would have more applications, much like you said about Ross. So anyway, that's not earth-shattering, but just want to
agree with that, Linda. Like, I do know that, like, for example, Notre Dame, Mendoza, and Tepper also jumped on the same bandwagon. For me, like, a couple of questions that I always have about the GMAT waivers is that, without the GMAT waivers, like, how are the schools participating in some of the rankings that do require like a GMAT score, like an average GMAT score, etc., in order to, obviously rank them. And then the second thing is about, very interested in to understand like how are, what are other metrics or indicators of success that schools are looking at to see who would be a better candidate or who would do really well in the programs.
I know Rotman at one point did some kind of reverse engineering where they looked at different metrics and they then saw, who did really well in the program. And it was actually the AWA, which is usually the thing that's looked at least. But that's what Rotman discovered. This was several years ago. And Rotman also was one of the first schools to say that if you have a CFA, you don't have to take the GMAT. And this, again, goes back years. It has nothing to do with COVID, nothing to do with the recent, this year's waivers and accommodations. But yeah, that was kind of what they did. And I think schools in general, at the AGAC conference last summer, they were all talking about how they're looking to try and find correlations with different metrics and success in business school and also beyond.
Sure.
This is riding on the coattails of Harvard Medical School withdrawing from U.S. News and World Report.
I think it was Harvard Law School.
Law school, yeah.
I think today, I think it's the medical school today.
Also today, really? I haven't heard it yet. All right.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole world of standardized testing has been kind of turned on its head. It's been kind of criticized for decades for various reasons. More recently with COVID in terms of getting access to a test center. But beyond that, like in terms of business school, it obviously doesn't test any of the key soft skills that business schools and companies, worldwide really look for. That's one big thing too. But even like the fact that considering it's a worldwide applicant pool and they're taking a test in English, there's obviously different levels of English, skill. If you're a native English speaker, there's some kind of advantage. At the same time, a lot of people who work in test prep, so you'd be surprised how many native English speakers can't, function in their own language in terms of testing for it. They know how to communicate verbally, but
yeah, I mean, if you look at what people read, right? Not everyone is reading The Economist and Utne. If they're reading other magazines, more pulpy, mainstream. They're not going to have the sophistication that they might have from reading other things. So it really runs the gamut. And someone who with English as a second language, they might have really studied the grammar, right? But they might know multiple languages and they understand roots of words. And so the vocabulary for the GRE is a lot easier. So it really just depends on the student.
Absolutely. And I think also schools, for those non-native English speakers who didn't immerse themselves in the grammar, I think the schools do cut them a little slack on the verbal portion. Not, doesn't mean you can get in the 30th percentile and get in, but a little slack that the school.
Well, they pushed it more towards meaning, right? So like the question sets feel more. You have to understand what are they trying to say, not what's the deep duke, right, Linda?
Yeah. Right.
Well, then you have the other.
Sorry, go ahead, Eric.
Well, I was kind of about to address you, Krithika, because most of your clients, I believe, come from your part of the world, India, which is known as kind of one of the most overrepresented populations in the MBA world, especially the Indian male engineer, right? That's the classic. We see a lot of them, and good for them. And it's also a country that is not only extremely numerous in population, but also, I think, culturally very competitive from the times that I've been to India, and also they're usually very strong English speakers, which. Being natively strong in English, but speaking a dialect in a way of English that is closer to Indian that might not correspond to the American English used in the GMAT, that's one challenge. But also we talked about, Linda, sorry, you mentioned how some schools will be a little bit more lenient to people who are not native English speakers versus an overrepresented population. They might be a little bit tougher and expect a higher GMAT score to choose among the stronger applicants, right, when they have a lot to choose from. So Krithika, you, I assume, face that challenge a lot with your clients.
Absolutely. So here, see, for example, I always joke that if you were somebody from Mongolia with a 720, we would have taken you, but you're in India. So 720 is not going to fly, and you just need like a 750 or even 760 and so on. So there is like that kind of score inflation, if you might call it. But I was just going to add, what do you guys think? Do you think the GMAT waivers would continue, or the GRE waivers would continue, or because I'm sure the GMAT and the ETS have been maintaining that these are very good indicators of comparing various different applicant pools, and you don't have anything else to compare. Like, this is the only standardized test score that's available. What do you guys think? Will it be there for the upcoming cycles? Will more schools adopt it?
I think they'll be more optional, but I don't think it's going to go away. I think there's definitely some value in the GMAT. Like we said in the beginning of this chat, was, for being sure that people are going to handle a lot of those classes during the MBA, right? There's a clear correlation between success in the GMAT and success in those classes. But with the shortcomings of standardized tests, there, I suppose, may be more and more leniency as it's optional. But if you can demonstrate your strength as an applicant in other areas of your application, that will fly. That's my guess.
Right. I agree. It's a package, and that's why it all depends.
It depends.
It depends, right? Exactly.
Might have to change the name of this podcast, Eric.
I was just going to say that. MBA Waves, it depends.
That's a great tagline.
We at least have to get t-shirts. You have to get T-shirts.
Definitely getting T-shirts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we're bringing those to the AGAT conference this June.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Anyone who's been a guest gets a free T-shirt. Anyway.
Sounds good.
All right. Anything else to add to this conversation about GMAT waivers?
I just say be cautious.
Mm-hmm. Do your homework as always.
It's a business decision, right? If you consider it a business decision, your application, like it is, it's your own PR and it's your own how you're going to move forward with it. So really think about what you're going to do.
Mm.
Yeah, it really shows your appetite for risk.
Mm. Yeah, and your application, like, I don't know, like your CV or your resume is kind of like your logo, your brand, like your essays are like your messaging, and your GMAT is like your balance statement, your balance sheet, right? And like those pieces like tell the company you want to do business with, aka the business school, that you're going to be a good partner in business. And it is a partnership. It absolutely is a partnership.
Anybody want to address GMAT versus GRE versus EA?
Yeah, I mean, that's a topic we definitely will have coming up in another episode of MBA Waves. We can do a little teaser right now. Absolutely.
I read an article about that. So yeah, it's an important question.
We can do a little teaser, Bar, if you want to lead it off a bit, or Linda, if you have any comments.
I'll let Linda do
it. I would say if you're not sure, take the exam you're going to do best on a percentile basis.
100%. And how do you find out? You do diagnostic tests, right?
Yes.
There's tests available. You see how you do, and you understand not just what you're getting wrong, but how you're getting it wrong. Right? That's how you move forward with this.
Yep. And go to the source, go to the GMAT's website, go to the GRE's website, and you can download actual official copies of the test. You can get a bunch of practice tests, questions, and do that first simulation, I think, before you've really put in the time to study for this thing, because you'll get that baseline score, right? And you'll kind of see where you stand, what you want to focus on. And I think it's also nice to do it before you study, because after you've studied and practice for a month or so, and you see that improvement, that gives you that confidence boost, like it's working, and that motivation to keep going.
It's like going on a diet. You don't weigh yourself after you've been dieting for a month, right? You want to just get the baseline. And
exactly.
Yeah.
It's an amazing analogy. So if you ask me personally, I will go for the EA. A lot more easier.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, so the EA, it's also made by the people who make the GMAT, right? Instead of 3.5 hours, it's 90 minutes, right? An hour and a half. There's no geometry. There's no EA. There's no, the writing part. Excuse me. There's no writing
AWA.
assessment. Yep. There's no AWA in the EA. So there's no writing section in the executive assessment test. It's obviously been designed for executive MBA applicants. But as we all know, there's a handful of schools, a growing number of schools, particularly in the US, I think perhaps in Canada starting to accept the EA as an alternative to the GMAT. Now, what I just said makes the EA sound a lot more attractive, a lot easier. Why? First question is, why would business schools accept it? And second of all, is it going to damage your admissibility if you go for that instead of the GMAT?
I think that's a great teaser. I think that's a really good place to...
Stay tuned. Coming soon on MBA.
It depends.
All right. I think that's it. We're going to wrap it up for today. Thank you so much, Linda, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yes. And
Bara, always a pleasure to see
you.
Great to see you.
Can't wait to see you in person in June, in early June, for the AGAT conference.
Sounds good. Is everyone
going to be there?
Yes. I think I'm going to be there. I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. Okay.
We'll be talking about AGAT in a future episode on MBA Waves. Meanwhile, next week, we're going to be talking about preparing for round 2 interviews. So see you next Tuesday live on MBA Waves. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.